First, I want to look at what happened in Niger and the widening fallout across Washington. So I'm joined by Malcolm Nance, a former DHS counterterror and intelligence officer, as well as longtime journalist Kurt Anderson, who is also the author of the book, Fantasyland, pretty relevant to part of this debate. Malcolm, what do you make of where this goes now as the military is trying to do relatively serious or nonpartisan briefings, but with the undertow of a president who continues to want to submerge everyone in what appear to be falsehoods?
Well, right now, the Department of Defense and the Special Operations Command and Africa Command are all going to be doing deep dive after-action reports to get to the bottom of how this ambush formed, how the personnel on the ground managed to fight on the ground. And there's one thing that's sort of missing from this story. You know, Sergeant Johnson got separated at some point, but he did manage to move a mile away from the contact point. That shows that he was fighting on the move. He was fighting and evading as a single-man unit. And the Defense Department is going to investigate that, and they're going to want to know how he got separated, what kind of combat support was brought in there, and whether it could be done faster. But, you know, there are two stories going on here. There's the political story, and then there's the story of these four heroes on the ground and their Special Forces ODA and how they managed to survive overwhelming odds. And all of these stories are eventually going to come out.
And General Dunforth gave this briefing today, Malcolm. Here's what he said about the information that's owed to the families.
And with regard to being transparent, I think we do owe the families and the American people transparency in incidents like this.
How should that work, Malcolm, given something you understand better than most of us, which is the aspects of this that are sensitive, even as they say they want to roll out what happened so people know?
Well, to a certain extent, we've had problems with this issue before. The transparency of the administration when a loved one, a member in the armed forces died. You might remember the issue with Pat Tillman when he was killed in Afghanistan. Former NFL player who became a Ranger, went into contact, and the initial report was that he was killed in combat by an enemy force. Turned out to be friendly fire. These issues should have been worked out in advance. These families deserve to know as much as humanly possible about the loss of their loved one. I served 20 years. I know exactly the pain that some of these families are in, and they need to know that this nation is taking care of them. Not that they're taking care of the timeline, not that they're taking care of some political activity or embarrassment. And that's why your first point about, General Kelly needing to come out and apologize, if that's what it takes to settle this issue and to give that family transparency. It's not one family, it's four family, and by extension, all the families in the armed forces that are watching this.
And not to be parsing, because I think you and I are getting at the same thing, but I'm not saying whether he should apologize or not. I don't necessarily see that as my role, Kurt. I am saying that the record suggests a falsehood. And so as a journalist, I'm pointing out the falsehood. I'm going to keep pointing it out. I'm going to play for you for your response what General Kelly said in going after this Congresswoman, in doing it while he wanted essentially to be treated with the deference of a military officer, and he played that up while making what was a false political attack.
The Congresswoman stood up, and in the long tradition of empty barrels making the most noise, stood up there and all of that, and talked about how she was instrumental in getting the funding for that building. Even for someone that is that empty a barrel, we were stunned.
That attack stays on the record. The video has been played. MSNBC went to the trouble of airing the entire video so everyone could see it in context and make up their own mind. Where do we go from here?
Well, but let's look. This has been a series of lies. This only became an issue a week ago when Donald Trump made it one in this impromptu press conference by lying about having written to almost every person who's died and lying about his predecessors never calling the survivors of dead soldiers and Marines. So those two lies existed. General Kelly gets out there, does the perfectly fine, moving beginning of this thing, and then, as you say, pivots to this lie about what the Congresswoman had done at a dedication of an FBI building he attended a few years ago. It's extraordinary. This doesn't need to exist. The Niger event is an event of a kind that happens. It could have been put away. Donald Trump could have answered that initial press conference question with, "My heart is with the survivors and their brave men who died." Mm-hmm. He wasn't asked any pressing question. He was asked, "Why haven't you said anything about this, Mr. President?"
Right. And let me play for you John McCain, Kurt. Again, military service, not a prerequisite to doing anything, but pretty notable to hear Senator McCain go there, as they say. Take a listen.
We drafted the lowest income level of America, and the highest income level found a doctor that would say that they had a bone spur. That is wrong. That is wrong.
Kurt.
I loved that, of course, because, of course, he didn't say, and like Donald Trump, he found a doctor to get his post-college deferment on the basis of a possibly spurious bone spur, but it was more elegantly done for that. No, precisely. And it, of course, brought up this greater, larger issue back then, before we had an all-volunteer armed services, of the incredible economic inequality that pertains to those who do and don't serve.
Your readers, who we count, I think, among some of our viewers, will note your use of the word spurious along with the word spur, which is what makes you a better writer than so many of us. Kurt Anderson and Malcolm Nance, thank you both. I want to turn now, as promised, to Congresswoman Maxine Waters, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, who has called on General John Kelly to apologize to Congresswoman Wilson. Congresswoman, what have we learned? What is your view of where we go from here? And what is it incumbent upon General John Kelly, Chief of Staff John Kelly, to do now that that video has been exposed?
Well, General Kelly can take the responsibility for admitting that he was wrong, that he had lied on the Congresswoman. I think it's important for us to all work to get this behind us. First of all, we should make it absolutely clear that our heart goes out to the families of all of the soldiers who were killed in Niger, and we should let them know that not only do they have our condolences, but we stand with them and we appreciate the sacrifice that they all are making. Having said that, this president, President Trump, did it again. He has the most distorted leadership of any president I've ever known or heard about. Here he had the opportunity to make the condolence call, to do it properly, to recognize this family and their grieving, and also to know the name of the soldier who had been killed. He did not remember the name. He didn't handle it well. And even if he had been counseled to talk about perhaps young people going into war, into service like this, understand the risks that are involved. But he didn't do it correctly, and he needs to admit that. First of all, he needs to apologize. He lied on other presidents that had gone on before him and saying they didn't do it as well as he did, that he called everybody. And then in typical Trump fashion, he gets off the phone when he is challenged, and then he backtracks and he tries to call all of those families. He gets his personnel to identify all of the families who have lost members in service to this country, and then he tries to make up by sending some kind of a letter or note to them. It is so unconscionable in the way that he manages his leadership. Having said that, General Kelly has had a good career, and to have his career really basically undermined by the President of the United States because he's trying to protect the President and standing up for the President when the President did not deserve to be stood up for. Now, he has damaged himself. His credibility is at question, and so he needs to call the Congresswoman and apologize. He lied on the Congresswoman. He said he was there. He said he heard her, and then when the video clip was played, that basically demonstrated exactly what she said and how she said it, it was obvious that he had lied. And so he needs to apologize. If the President will apologize to Mrs. Johnson, and if General Kelly will apologize to Congresswoman, then I think that we can put this behind us. But until that is done, it is not going to go away. You're absolutely correct. All of the women of the Congressional Black Caucus have come together, and we're demanding an apology. We are sick and tired of women being undermined, being dismissed, and black women in particular being called names. She was called wacky. On it, Frederica Wilson is an honorable member of the House of Representatives.
Well, let me ask you about that
respect.
in particular,
yes.
because I follow the CBC, and it does a whole range of work on policy, but you were bringing it up. Is it your view that she was being treated differently because of her race and gender?
I think that goes along with it. He seems to have this tendency to talk down to people of color, to treat them with disrespect. And I think this adds to it. I think the fact that, first of all, he called her wacky. Secondly, that he didn't back down, that he simply talked about her in a way that was not respectful. I think that, yes, I think this adds to the suspicion of him and the way that he thinks about minorities and black people in particular.
Congresswoman Waters, thank you for coming on The Beat.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.